Hello, and welcome to this latest episode of the Driving at Profit with Zero Emissions podcast. I'm Barbara Albert, co-CEO of 100% Renewables, a consultancy specializing in the development of net zero strategies. The urgent need for society to drastically cut its emissions of greenhouse gases is highlighted in the first two of the reports of the IPCC's sixth assessment reporting cycle. The Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 reports highlight the need for deep cuts to be made to emissions in the next 7 years if we are to have any chance of avoiding catastrophic climate change. They also highlight the vulnerability of both ecosystems and human systems to the changes that are already happening. In Australia, we finally seem to be on the verge of real breakthroughs that will see our electricity grid decarbonise in the next couple of decades, as highlighted in DISE's October 21 report and AEMO's draft 2022 Integrated System Plan. And rooftop solar remains popular with homes and businesses, with around 30% of dwellings now having solar. But there remains much to do to decarbonise Australia's economy, with transport, gas combustion, industrial, agriculture, and fugitive emissions, waste and land use all playing important roles in our overall emissions picture. Today's topic is about reducing transport emissions. Transport emissions account for roughly 19% of Australia's emissions, making it the third largest source of emissions. Today, we will be talking about our power transport sector and how we can shift from fossil fuels to cleaner ways of transporting people and goods, such as electric vehicles and renewable hydrogen. Of course, active transport is also a big part of the decarbonisation of transport in our cities and towns, and we aim to have a future podcast that focuses on that aspect of mobility. For this special podcast episode, I'll be interviewing three people with significant experience in the transport sector, coming from the car manufacturing perspective, the policy perspective, and the motorist perspective. Joining me today is Scott Nargar, David Malicki, and Nikesh Murali. Scott Nargar is the Senior Manager of Future Mobility and Government Relations at Hyundai Motor Company Australia. Scott has over 2 decades of experience in the motor industry in technical, media, product planning, and technology advocacy roles. For the last 10 years, Scott has been working for Hyundai in senior technical management, product planning, environment, and government engagement policy roles. Scott leads the company's hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle project and future mobility programs. Scott was the co-founder of the Australian Hydrogen Council and is currently a member of its board of directors. David Malicki is the team lead Net Zero Transport at New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment. His team is responsible for delivering $260 million in initiatives under the New South Wales Electric Vehicle Strategy and the New South Wales Net Zero Plan Stage 1. He is an experienced business team lead with a demonstrated history of working in the environmental services industry. He is skilled in government procurement, environmental issues, sustainable business management, and building effective relationships. Nikesh Murali is a senior policy advisor at the NRMA, specializing in electric vehicles, future transport, and low carbon technology. Prior to the role at the NRMA, he worked as a policy advisor in the Australian Federal Public Service on policy initiatives in transport, future mobility, maritime, and airports and aviation. He has an interest and expertise in shaping and promoting the feasibility and opportunities created by transitioning to net zero emissions in the transportation and energy sectors. Hi, and welcome to the Driving at Profit with Zero Emissions podcast. Scott, David, and Nikesh, it's fantastic to have the three of you here today on my show. I wanted to start the interview with asking what the trends in the future of transport. How do different fuel types play a part? So, for instance, hydrogen, electricity, biofuels. Is it all of these? And will it depend on the needs of different modes of transport like cars, trucks, buses, trains, ships, and planes? If I can briefly go to each of you in turn, starting with Scott.
Great question. And I think the technology and all the technology mentions are all complementary. So from a Hyundai Motor perspective, we have a range of electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, hydrogen buses, trucks, hydrogen trams coming off the production line now. And we also build ships. So we've got a whole portfolio of everything that's going to be needed for the future, from whether it be road transport, rail or marine. And it's really looking at how that technology is used. So the heavier the platform, hydrogen fuel cell is going to come more into its own. And the lighter the platform, it's where we see EVs being a really good replacement. So think about, probably the best way to think about it is EV is going to replace petrol and fuel cell is going to replace diesel. It's the best way to kind of think about the technologies and the platforms.
What about you, David?
Yeah, I'd agree that all of those fuel types you mentioned will play a part in the transition to low or zero emission vehicles in the future. It's a fair bit of kind of crystal balling to know which of hydrogen or electricity will ultimately succeed across the different categories. And there are different players in the market with different offerings in place and investigating and researching and building against those different fuel types. At the moment, most, as Scott kind of alluded to, most commentators will be saying that in the light vehicle space, passenger vehicles, utes, LCVs, that electric vehicles have won that race. And that's for a few reasons. There's some challenges with kind of the cost and the efficiency of hydrogen vehicles. They're not selling terrifically compared to electric vehicles. In Australia, it was around 40 hydrogen passenger vehicles last year compared to around 20,000 EVs. But the refueling infrastructure is probably the key point with lighter vehicles. Every wall socket is an electric vehicle charger. So there's tens of millions of those across Australia, of course, in every building. Whereas governments are starting to invest in hydrogen refueling infrastructure, but states are focusing in on the key freight routes in terms of building that.
So what is your view, Nikesh?
Yeah, I echo David's sentiments. There's 20 million passenger EVs, 1.3 million commercial EVs, and about 280 million electric mopeds on the road now. Pretty much everything that moves, bikes, scooters, cars, forklifts, trucks, buses, and agricultural equipment are all being electrified. So I'll repeat my oft-repeated mantra that the future is electric for those sectors. And obviously, like David mentioned, lots of supporting factors, OEMs bringing in electrification targets. There's rapid deployment of chargers by governments because of the commitments towards net zero targets. Companies like Amazon and DHL are pledging, the purchases of thousands of electric vehicles. So again, that mantra, I think electric is future holds true, but hydrogen has a very important role to play with shipping, trucking, and aviation. Unfortunately for biofuels, I think there's only like 3% transport demand for them. And I don't think they are on the trajectory to attain net zero targets. And part of this is because you have to mix them with fossil fuels to achieve any kind of use currently. There's also some argument around the fact that they, with the kind of biofuel feedstock demand, they actually might have higher GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and also because of all the factors that I said before, it requires a substantial market intervention or subsidies, which I don't think there's a lot of policy appetite for that. So that's where biofuels sit. But pretty much echoing everything that David and Scott have said previously.
I just wanted to bring up this point that Scott mentioned previously, that basically all petrol-powered vehicles are going to be replaced with EVs and diesel is going to be replaced with hydrogen. Do you agree with Scott's view there as well?
I might jump in on this one, Barbara. I think there's some electric offerings in the heavy vehicle space already being conceptualized and tested and built by some organizations, and there's some hydrogen options being built in that space as well. So there's a lot in the rollout of the refueling infrastructure, both electricity and hydrogen refuelers, as well as a range of factors, both economic and I guess a social license to operate and so forth in these different segments. There's no one answer yet, I don't think.
Yeah. But I think broadly, Scott's logic is accurate. It's a good way to start thinking about how that transition is going to happen. But David's right. Like it's very much dependent on so many different factors. So we really can't nail down the trajectory as yet.
And the markets themselves are going to determine that. So it's the practicality of the technology. If you need something that fills up very quickly and can do very long distances and carry heavy loads, then it'll more than likely be hydrogen. But if you can have the truck or the bus or whatever it might be charging for a bit longer, and you don't need to do those rapid fills like line haul would need a rapid fill, then an electric truck would be perfect for that. No, there's that 4.5 tonne to 6.5 tonne truck. We're already starting to see electric trucks here in Australia now. And it's really looking at where we head to with that heavy stuff. And then we head all the way out to, from line haul into heavy rail, and then agriculture, and then heavy mining, and then shipping. So that's where we'll probably see more fuel cell than battery, but the technology is complementary. There's so much technology in our hydrogen fuel cell Nexo that came out of our electric Kona EV. So the electric motor in both vehicles is the same part number. The control systems are the same part number. The 64 kilowatt hour battery in Kona EV is the battery we use in our electric and hydrogen fuel cell buses or trucks. So it's complementary technology with a lot of shared components. And as we move to, from a Hyundai sense, with our Ioniq 5 as the first car that rides on the Hyundai Motor Group's e-global modular chassis, and then you've got Ioniq 6 coming this year, the Genesis EV coming this year, and Kia's EV6, all run on a shared chassis, which is going to ensure that we have more consistency, less complexity during manufacturing, and hopefully reducing the cost and getting the cars down to parity. And it's all about getting parity. And the big one is building an infrastructure is huge, and it's we're not doing it well in Australia when it comes to EVs, and it's a lot harder with hydrogen fuel cell. We need to plan as a country, and what we're really hoping from, and post the federal election that's just been announced, is really strong federal leadership in this case, and consistency across the states. There's some amazing stuff being done, and especially with David's government, New South Wales government, ACT had some amazing things as well. As a global car manufacturer that sells cars in every state and territory in Australia, we love to see consistency and have all the other states climbing up to the bars that were set by the New South Wales government and hopefully exceeding them. So it's something that we're really happy to see, but it's just getting that consistent infrastructure across Australia for both EV and fuel cell.
Yeah, so definitely infrastructure is super important. But what is the advantage of hydrogen fuel cells over just standard electric vehicles?
The biggest one at the moment is the charging. So we can charge the Hyundai Nexo in 3 minutes and do over 660 kilometres. Even the fastest car in the world now, which is the Ioniq 5 and the Porsche Taycan, they're going from 10% charge to about 80% charge in about 16 minutes with the 350 kilowatt charges. So we're still not at that point of charging a hydrogen fuel cell car, whether it be the Hyundai Nexo or the Toyota Mirai. But the technology is getting there and emerging as we move to new battery technologies and solid state batteries and even faster chargers. We'll see things evolve and the technologies combine.
Yeah, it's still an evolving space. So who's actually leading the race? Because I hear a lot in the news about Tesla as a manufacturer, for example, or about Norway as a leading country where at the beginning of this year, 84% of new car sales were electric. This is actually a true reflection of what's happening in the marketplace. What about other modes of transport or other manufacturers or even other countries?
I'm happy to start the answer on this one. I might split it into talking about the car makers and then other jurisdictions around the world. So firstly, on the car maker front, in Australia, you're right. The Teslas sell 60%, I think, of Australia's EVs, something around that mark currently to date. But more and more offerings and models are becoming available right across the different brands. And so, that's expected to change over time as other car makers tool up to be building electric vehicles. Car makers, I suppose, new car makers building from the ground up have an advantage around they're only starting to build EVs. They don't have a historical manufacturing lines, bureaucracies, supply chains to change. So, those of the likes of Polestar, of Rivian, of Tesla and so forth, but they're small to begin with as well. They're startups essentially. And so the incumbent car makers who are making already millions of vehicles a year have the advantage when they tool over that they're extremely experienced in building cars and shifting over and having gigantic global supply chains. But that being said, most, if not all of the car makers have got targets in place, and they're setting targets around no longer designing or building internal combustion engine vehicles at certain points in time. They're all a bit different, but there's lots of commitments being made out there. and there's tens of billions of dollars of investment into both the manufacturing side of things as well as the research around battery technologies and hydrogen and the different chemistries and so forth that are available. And then moving on to countries, yes, Norway's the leading light in terms of sales uptake, and they've done that through using a lot of the levers of government to bring the price down to be close to parity with internal combustion engines, and that's a clear indication that does work. But Europe is probably the leading continent around EV uptake, and that's probably down to their strong fuel efficiency standards and penalty regime, credit regime around the emissions efficiency of vehicles that are sold into Europe. And just in the last couple of weeks, the European Parliament has legislated, I think, for the no more sales of internal combustion engines by 2035, I believe that is. But there's other jurisdictions around the world that are also very strong, progressive and proactive on the shift to zero emissions vehicles. So you look at a place like China or the USA as an example, and particularly big states like California and New York, significant investment into the charging infrastructure, incentives to encourage early uptake, and sales bans and so forth. So it's a global phenomenon, just happening at different paces in different locations.
And what about Nikesh?
Yeah, look, David's kind of presentation of the global spread is accurate in that it's Norway, as you pointed out, that's and Scandinavia as a whole, that's leading in substantial uptake of hybrids and EVs. Europe and China lead the way. I think they've got 16 and 14% market share. I think next comes the US at about 4.5%. And I think that once electric utes become easily manufactured, then you'll see the adoption rates in their pick up. Obviously, Tesla's had a significant advantage, but as David pointed out, with the various individual targets that the companies have set, the OEMs have set, some of the estimates show us that by 2025, Volkswagen is likely to lead the race, but everyone's playing catch up very quickly. And I think in terms of sales numbers, it's we've previously spoken, it's passenger EVs that have got the bulk of the sales, but electric buses come very close by. There was high demand in 2021 for medium and light commercial vehicles. We're seeing increased registrations for electric buses and business and commercial vehicles over the last 2 years. And I think that with increased commitment from a lot of the manufacturers in that sector, like Daimler and Renault and Scania and Volvo, even though commercial vehicles are sitting at around third now on the ranking table, it's playing catch up fast. But I think broadly the trends that David talked about is exactly how it's progressing.
And all manufacturers have to do it. We don't have a choice. Emission regulations around the world are driving change, which I think is a great thing. But as a global car manufacturer, we also need to sell a lot of the current vehicles to pay for the R&D for the future vehicles. And we've been doing R&D on electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles for over 25 years, and having 65 plants around the world, we need to ensure that those plants in different markets and the plants providing for different regions around the world, and most of ours come out of Korea and some from Europe, are European plants, that we have the right technology in the right place, one, to meet emission regulations, to also meet consumer choice. You've got to make sure you're building things that people want to buy, the car's attractive, and everything else is what they need from the practicality of the car, the safety, the technology within inside the vehicle as well, and then package it in a way that's affordable. And the technology is not cheap at the moment for any car manufacturer, and no one's at parity just yet, although everyone's working hard for it. And things like global modular chassis can be used from a Hyundai Motor Group perspective across Hyundai, Kia, and our Genesis brands, really helps a lot. The other big one is really ensuring that we have in place the supply chains. The biggest thing with anything is supply chains, ensuring you've got the right resources. So from a Hyundai perspective, everything's built out of our Korean plants, 100% Australian steel, and you'll see a lot of battery technology and resources coming out of that. It will be Australian as well. So very proud to say, anything that's coming out of Korea, whether it's a train, a ship, or or a car or a truck as our steel, but then you can look at those other resources, and they come from a number of places around the world. We are blessed with a lot of resources here, but there's a lot of countries that also have that. We've seen disruptions in the last couple of months with the issues in Europe and the war in Ukraine about supply chains, not just for resources for vehicles, but also resources for energy grids. So there's a big evolution here. Everyone wants independence, and in Australia here, we certainly want energy independence when it comes to our transport fuels, but we also want to ensure we've got the right supply of minerals coming for our vehicles.
Yeah, for sure. What does it look like in Australia? Like I hear a lot about these supply issues, but what's the uptake here in Australia in the passenger and SUV space? At what rate is it growing?
I think the Electric Vehicle Council reported that the sales last year was 3 times from the previous year. So demand is extremely high. Overwhelmingly, we are seeing that the trends are for the fastback format or the SUV format. I think cars like Volvo XC40, the Polestars, Hyundai Konas, they're selling really well. The Benz has a few SUV models like EQC, EQA that are really selling well. Utes, as you know, make up 20% of the market here in Australia, very popular, but obviously we don't have a lot of vehicles coming in that arena, but they are coming soon. So there's Ford F-150s that are coming out in mid-2023, LDV EV-T60s, GWM Utes, some of the names that I can remember. There's a new BMW iX, it might already be out. So as you can see, fastback and the SUV format is very popular, but also these new utes that are coming. Big players like Toyota, which makes the Hilux, which is the dual cab segment, they haven't, even the Toyota's surging forwards in the terms of their electric journey. I haven't heard much in terms of commitments on when we will see those popular dual cab segment expand. Same with VW Amarok. There's electrification plans, but no solid commitments. And there's of course the Tesla Cybertruck. So it'll be interesting to see if all those popular vehicles enter the market fairly soon. What's interesting though is that I think with the utes, it might be the boutique manufacturers that might get a head start over traditional OEMs if based on what we know now, because things could change in a matter of months. But I think Rivians of the world might make an entry. I even read recently about a company called OSMV and Atlas Motor Group. I think they are importing right-hand, left-hand drives and then converting it in Queensland and selling them. So it'll be interesting to see who the boutique players are who will contribute to like the expansion of the ute segment when it comes to EVs.
Are you foreseeing that that's a really important thing for Australia, because we do like our big cars?
Absolutely. That'll change the narrative a lot, I think. It's already changing. You can tell from the demand that the narrative is already changed, but that segment's expansion will significantly change the narrative.
I'd say absolutely. And model availability is a huge thing because it's consumers decide based on the fit for purpose nature of the vehicles, the kind of vehicle they want to drive and need to drive, and then they choose the other features around that vehicle. And part of that is whether it's electric or petrol. That tripling of sales of EVs last year that Nikesh mentioned, absolutely true. It's great. It's the start of that curve, that hockey stick curve up to full electrification of the fleet over time. But we're moving off a low base in Australia. So last year we're still at 2% sales being EVs. And you compare that to that Norway stat that you talked about before, over 80% already. In New South Wales, we have a sales ambition or target with our New South Wales electric vehicle strategy. And the intent is to accelerate the uptake of electric vehicles so that we're at 52% of new car sales being EV by 2030 and the vast majority by 2035. And that's based on a whole lot of modelling and our ambition to accelerate that transition in New South Wales. And it's really important because vehicles stay on the road, we know, 10 to 15 years. That's their on-the-road life. And so to have all sales being EV by 2035 is quite critical to achieving a net zero target by 2050.
And that's one of the big benefits, I suppose, where we see that. We've got clearer targets coming up from government. What we are looking forward to is emission regulation, which we touched on earlier. As a vehicle manufacturer, we send the bulk of our electric vehicles to countries where we have the biggest financial liabilities. So we're going to send a lot of cars to Europe and to California and into the Korean market and other places where there are incentives for consumers to take up those vehicles, but there are also penalties for manufacturers that don't have it. And under the corporate fleet averages, you need to have a percentage of your vehicles being zero emission to offset the other ones as we transition away from internal combustion. We don't have that here. The one benefit we do have from a Hyundai sense is that everything we have overseas for zero emission vehicles, we have here in Australia. We just don't have the volumes to satisfy the demand. The demand for Ioniq 5 is phenomenal. We're going to see the same thing this year with Ioniq 6, next year with Ioniq 7, and we've got 3 Genesis EVs launching this year. In fact, our Genesis brand goes 100% zero emission, whether it be fuel cell or EV, by 2025. So that shows you how quick we're moving in one part of our portfolio, and obviously Kia, the other part of our brand, have got their own targets they're setting. But we have our own net zero emission targets within Hyundai Motor Group, from the production, from the shipping. We own our own shipping lines and build our own ships, so we've got that kind of vertically integrated network from supplying all the parts and right through, so we can control a lot of our destiny. We are working very, very hard. There's some big announcements about new hydrogen fuel cell factories in Korea and China, and we're building new EV production plants. One just opened just a couple of months ago in Indonesia, another one coming up in Singapore, and the big announcements in the last couple of weeks about the big EV production plants and battery assembly plants in the US, supported by the US government. So it's not just Hyundai. All manufacturers are doing this because we're all battling the same emission regulations. And it's not a battle, it's something that we were all asking for. And in Australia, we've got the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industry. We have the voluntary emission regulations in Australia. So it's something we're doing ourselves and naming and shaming ourselves. We don't penalise ourselves, but really we want government to adopt that and really focus on getting zero emission vehicles here.
That's great. And you mentioned the new factories that are being built. But what stage of development are fuel cell EVs at in terms of commercialization and uptake, or what role or market segments do you expect it will play a role in going forward?
Yeah, well, the passenger vehicles, both ourselves and Toyota, have vehicles here at the moment in a number of markets around the world, and they're going well. We do about 10,000 of those each year in Korea, and another 10 to 15,000 that covers the other markets around the world. Still a fraction of what we make globally, and a fraction of the global car market. The biggest thing there is infrastructure. I've got a lot of customers, a lot of pent-up demand in Australia. I've just got nowhere to fuel them. So we've maxed out the ACT station. The date was commissioned. We're expecting the Queensland Government hydrogen station and the ADCO gas Perth station in Jandakot to come online in the next 3 to 6 months. And then we'll continue to work with David and all the teams across the New South Wales, Victorian and Queensland governments for the networks. From a truck perspective, they're on the road. They're in Switzerland right now because there are a lot of incentives to have trucks on the road there. It's massive penalties for internal combustion trucks per 1,000 kilometres, and actually makes it really beneficial to have those trucks in that market, and the economics work out. In other markets, you don't have those incentives, so the cost between an internal combustion truck and hydrogen fuel cell are still very different, and that needs to be sorted out. We need to get the trucks down as cheap as possible, as soon as possible. But you've also got to make sure that they're practical, they're durable, they're doing the same loads, they're filling up very quickly, and that's where we kind of see. At a certain point, batteries will be used up to a certain point, and then fuel cell from then on. But there are there's companies here in Australia that have done battery swap out trials in trucks recently, which for myself, being a technology advocate and before Hyundai spent 10 years at the NRMA writing about technology and testing it, looking at it. I just love seeing technology. I don't care what brand it's from. Let's just get the technology here. There's so much pent up demand in this market that all manufacturers that bring vehicles here will do very well, and we encourage it. We want more competition. We want to see more competitors here, especially with light electric vehicles and affordable electric vehicles. That's going to drive consumer awareness, consumer consideration of purchase, and then when that happens, you're going to see more politicians become more aware of the changing nature or consideration of purchase requirements for consumers. They're going to put a lot more policy in place, a lot more money in place to support that. It's already happening to a degree here in Australia, and as we said, NRMA and the New South Wales Government are doing a great job in this area. We try to try and get the rest of Australia up to that same bar and move the whole country forward at once.
Yeah, I'm glad Scott brought up that point about Korea, because I think the real success story there was that they did set up targets And the result of the target was that in 2020, they had about 10,000 FCEVs on the road. And I think they have a 2040 target for about 3 million FCEVs, most of them domestically manufactured as well. So, I think having those targets really help. And I think what's happened recently is with the trucking and delivery companies wanting to adopt hydrogen cell vehicles, I think, that's going to drive some kind of a target in the near future. But yeah, very important.
One of the best things we spoke about, the scalability and the modular platforms. When we look at hydrogen fuel cell, we use one 90 kilowatt stack in the Hyundai Nexo. In our buses, we use 2 of that, exactly the same stack. In the trucks, we use 3 of them. In a larger truck, we'd use 4. In a stationary fuel cell to help with power generation and maintaining frequency in the power grid, we use 2 or 4 or 6. It's that same part. In our ships, we'll have them stacked up 10 tall and have potentially hundreds of modules of those stacks in a ship, and relying on bunker ammonia or bunker hydrogen, not bunker oil. So that technology goes from the car to the bus, to the truck, to the train, tram, and to the ship or stationary fuel cell. It's that same part number. It's the same box, and there's no moving parts inside that box, which is really awesome.
So we've heard earlier that you see one of the main barriers in the market being the available infrastructure and consumer awareness. But I was wondering, what are most of the key barriers to electric vehicle and fuel cell electric vehicle uptake in Australia? Because obviously it's such a good technology, it saves so many emissions. So why aren't more people and businesses switching to electric vehicles?
I'd say there's 3 key barriers, and they're common not only in New South Wales and Australia, but globally in every jurisdiction that's trying to shift to electric vehicles. And those are price, their choice, and their range anxiety, or the availability of public charging infrastructure. And all those 3 combined, it's different for different people, and different organisations might feel one of those barriers more than another, but they all come into play a little bit. And that's where jurisdictions are really laser focused on overcoming those barriers with upfront price incentives, with building out enabling charging infrastructure, and encouraging the new models into the country, although that's a global phenomenon and we're seeing that shift quite quickly across the global car industry.
What we mentioned about the global shift, we are seeing from some car manufacturers, it hasn't impacted ourselves as yet too much, but some car manufacturers are really struggling to get the internal combustion engine they need for certain markets around the world. And Australia is one of those. I know a lot of the European manufacturers, our fuel quality here is really not good. And a lot of the most advanced engines in the world, your lean burn GDI engines, struggle to run on the fuel here. So people aren't building really efficient hybrid or plug-in hybrid drivetrains with an older style conventional internal combustion engine. They're going to be teamed up with a lean burn GDI engine and be really, really efficient, but those engines don't run on the fuel here. So we've got a great opportunity to almost leapfrog that transition. We know that fuel quality is going to change here in 2026, 2027, and things will evolve there. But I think by then, under the current federal and state governments, I think we're going to see a shift happening before that change. We're going to see a lot more EVs come here. But the big one is key, as David said, we need consumer choice, and we can't build everything that consumers want. And people line up different brands for different reasons. We really want to see more affordable EVs here in the Australian market for us to compete with, and we're happy to put our cars head to head with anyone's car. If we can encourage them to come here, whether it's through competition or whatever it might be, bring your cars here. There's a place for them. There's a market for it. You probably have the same problem we have at the moment. We will sell out and have more unhappy customers that can't get a car rather than people that can't afford one. The market's in a good place at the moment, but the biggest drama is we just can't get the volumes of anything, whether it's ours, Teslas, Nissans, the MGs. Everyone's struggling with that volume at the moment to meet up that pent-up demand, which is awesome. And that's happening because of the work by people like the NRMA and the New South Wales Government, who have put those the awareness campaigns in place, the incentives and the policies in place.
And there's an observable phenomenon which is every new electric vehicle model that becomes available in Australia and the order books open, thousands, if not tens of thousands of orders are made within weeks. So I think
Scott has the record there, doesn't he? I think Ioniq sold out in 5 minutes. Is that correct, Scott?
Yeah, generally 4 to 5 minutes is the sell-out time, and I think there's about 18 to 20,000. It was well over 20,000 at one stage of expressions of interest every time it comes up. And it does hurt us inside, and it hurts staff to see that there's so many people that are disappointed every time those couple of hundred cars come up. But it's just the nature of what it is. It's the process at the moment, and that's the direction we've gone. Other manufacturers are doing different ways of distributing vehicles, but it's so hard when you've got such a small volume of vehicles to get the right colour, the right drivetrain combination, the right battery size across one of the 7 ports in Australia and then one of the 175 dealers across Australia to make sure you get the right kind of location for the right customer. So for ourselves at the moment, going down this route is the way to go. And other manufacturers are doing different things, but you're going to see that whole environment evolve as well, and things will change in the future.
I just want to talk a bit about what you pointed out, Barbara, in terms of uptake with residential charging in particular, because it's a matter close to my heart now, because we are trying to buy a property, and one of the questions we ask is about EV charger availability in the apartment blocks, and I think that's a key kind of barrier. And globally, the kind of the acceptable policy around that is that there should be 100% charging in commercial in residential complexes for EVs, and about 10 to 20% in commercial buildings. But obviously, there are issues in Australia around that. Urbis, I think that's how you pronounce it. They're a consultancy who did a report for the ACT government, and they were talking about great reluctance among building managers and stratas to put charges in there. And and the report talks about lots of benefits, greenhouse gas emissions reductions being at the top of it, but also rental increases for properties where we will actually be able to provide a charger, and definitely a capital uplift for the building as well, if that's provided. There is some work being conducted at the moment by the Australian Building Codes Board. I think it's coming out mid-year, which will enable it easy to retrofit some of the buildings and take away some of that pain. But I think the New South Wales government has got a lot of wonderful resources for Stratas, which I'm sure Dave will be happy to talk about. That gives them guidance on how to facilitate the process, whether it's retrofitting or whether it's new planning controls for new buildings. So I think that's very key, because when you talk to people about EVs generally in a barbecue chat, they always say, "Oh, but I'm not really sure I have charging in my building, or whether my Strata is going to accept that, and I'm not sure what the costs are going to be." So that's very important too, that we address that. So not just have planning controls, but make sure that's implemented, and then obviously support building managers and Stratas with it.
When you say, Nikesh, 100%, are you suggesting that every unit in an apartment block has a charger available?
Ideally, because that is the policy standard, so we should work towards that. So my go-to is David's the New South Wales government's page to try and understand what those resources are that enable Stratas to make that call. David, did you have more insights on that?
Yeah, look, it's a really important point, because 70% of Australians across the country have access to off-street parking, and that includes within strata buildings or detached homes, and that's where most charging occurs. So it's really important that charging availability is in these buildings, but we have at the same time thousands of buildings that need to be retrofitted to include the electrical infrastructure to provide chargers within those buildings. So there's been a huge, it's a new space, right? So buildings never had to think about it before, but increasingly they're getting asked the question, I would like to buy an EV, I have an EV, how do I charge it in my building where I'm a tenant or an owner? So that question is coming up more and more. And there's just been a lack of information or guidance around what to do, how to do it, what the costs are, and so forth. So in New South Wales, we identified that information gap. And as Nikesh said, we've got a suite of resources, a toolkit, as you were, which talks through what the different options are for building out electric vehicle charging infrastructure within buildings, both commercial and strata buildings, a costing calculator, because understanding the cost estimate of what this is important, to build a backbone in a backbone electrical infrastructure within a strata building with about 100 car parking spots can cost around $100,000. So it's what needs to be thought about by stratas and considered within their sinking funds. But there's also lots of templates to go to market to find contractors to have model and template bylaws that stratas need to put in place to enable it. And so that's all on the retrofitting front. It's going to increase in interest and importance as we progress. And then, as Nikesh mentioned, at the national level, the National Construction Code this year, there'll be requirements put in place for new buildings to have to install that electrical infrastructure to allow for chargers to be put in place down the track. So yes.
And I suppose this is where what the New South Wales government is doing as we wait for this transition to happen, which, because of its expense and the duration will be a long time. I think having chargers every 5 kilometers in residential areas with limited off-street parking, I think that's really going to come into play and assist people for the uptake as we wait for this transition process to happen. So that's really beneficial.
And it's also that evolution of charging. And we had at one stage had more EV chargers here in our site in Sydney than anywhere else in Australia. We had 26 AC and then DC and then the hydrogen station. But we went through and laid cable tray through 2 basement levels of our building here and did pay an absolute fortune. But we do have room to put a couple of hundred EV chargers down there now because the cable trays have been let and done. But to do that during the construction phase would have been far cheaper, far easier. All our chargers are network controlled, so we can load balance and load shift and protect the building and keep the lights on and the heater going when everything's charging. We're producing hydrogen here, so we're learning as we're going along as well. I think that whole education piece is critical. It's not just how do building managers and how do Strata people understand what the tech is, because it's all too hard. They don't want to know about it. It's easy to say, no, we don't do it, go away. We see the same thing as we shift the conversation towards business fleets. A business fleet manager has been so used to over the years of ordering a new batch of 20 Hyundai i30s. Here's your Ampol or BP fuel card, and off you go and you do the job, and they know what the insurance is. They've got to think about home charging. They've got to think about reimbursements. And there's some great solutions and ways to get around that. And we were on a drive day recently with Origin Energy in New South Wales, and also I think it was part funded by the New South Wales Government. And they had a great example of Uniting Care. Fleet manager came along and said, I have a whole lot of EVs with our staff that do the home care for elderly people. And we've got to the point now, or they've got to the point where they can reimburse their staff on a weekly basis. They're actually getting to the point and working on it and not far off it, where they can reimburse their staff nightly for the energy they use to charge the vehicle at night. The technology's there. It's just a matter of adopting that technology and making people aware of it, whether it's the fleet managers or the Strata people, that it can be done. And there's plenty of good people around Australia that can help. And we could probably name a dozen companies, which we won't hear, that can help today. But there are some great examples of tech that's being used. And we're not leading here in anything. It's been done overseas in the US and Europe and Korea and Japan for a number of years. It's just picking up the technology when it's most mature and adopting it here in Australia. And a lot of that's to do with just getting the basic education out there first.
Spot on. And that integration of vehicles into the grid, I think we've mentioned load management. That's really important, because a building managing the charging, ensuring that it's orchestrated between the different chargers, and charging's happening in off-peak periods and so forth, means that the supply side grid supply of energy doesn't even need to be augmented in most cases. It can be managed through smart controls, and they can be linked through to air conditioning systems and other large loads within a building. And that's quite critical to think about that load management and integrate the electric vehicles into those buildings really efficiently.
Yeah, even with our smart chargers, I mean, our cars, I'm assuming our competitors' cars too, you can go home and set your car, plug it in when you get home, and you can set the car within 2 taps of the screen to start charging at 9 o'clock at night or 11 o'clock at night, or when our off-peak cuts in, because you're going to be paying the best or the lowest rate of electricity for your vehicle. If a car's home during the day, that you want to start charging at 10 o'clock in the morning when you've got the most solar penetration on the house. So there's great tech in the cars. There's great smart controllers and meters on the market now, and more coming. And if we look at, I suppose, we're not going to get into a big grid energy security conversation here, but the tech in the vehicles in the future, when you've got, we've got 64 kilowatt hour batteries in our Konas now. We've got some of our future cars have 90 plus kilowatt hour batteries, and so do our competitors. Once vehicle to grid comes along in Type 2 CCS, the most, the common plug we have used in Australia, what a great technology to help maintain frequency in our grid and be able to manage high load frequencies in areas that we have. In this energy crisis we're talking about this week in a couple of eastern states in Australia, the vehicles, everyone thinks the vehicles are going to impact that, but actually people just be able to help deal with those events in the future if they're charged at the right times.
It'll be the birth of the real prosumer in vast numbers, so that'll be incredible.
Absolutely. And the Australian National University estimated that if all vehicles in Australia were electrified, it gives us the storage capacity of 5 snowy Hydro 2s. So there's the sheer capacity within electric, and that's distributed energy assets as well. So, you know, each of these electric vehicles with the battery capacity Scott mentioned can power the average home for 2 to 3 days. An entire home for 2 to 3 days off the vehicle, as well as being a vehicle. So the opportunities are quite limitless there.
Having just paid my power bill yesterday, that's a very exciting notion.
And it's an exciting time where we talk about people not having off-street parking and can't do things. We've had examples the last couple of weeks of customers that have fought very hard and worked with councils to be able to have an extension lead overpass with the right safety precautions put in place and different things, which has surprised me, but good on them for doing that. Another one is that, you know, it's not just the oil companies have shown their hand and where they want to be with EV charging and hydrogen fuel charging in the future. And obviously NRMAs have been a great leader in this space with the rollout of all those 50 kilowatt tritium stations across regional New South Wales, and the next phase of that looking to go national during that announcement with the Labor leader during the campaign launch. And what New South Wales is doing, it's the Coles, it's the Woolworths, it's the Audis, it's the local government council chambers of the library that become a refueling station. They might not sell Coca-Cola and ice blocks and you know, hot dogs and different things, but anyone can become a petrol station of the future or a transport charging station of the future. And that's what's really exciting. You know, why can't the local library or the local Macca's or whatever it might be sell the energy to propel your vehicle in the future? It's not just the home or a oil company. We've got a great opportunity in the future when everyone can see there's a dollar to be made here. We're seeing it now with shopping centres. It's kind of a funny one. Shopping centres offering free electric vehicle charging. It's on an AC charge, so it's very slow. You're not getting a whole lot of energy, but they've got shopping centres that are covered in solar. They've got excess energy anyway, getting nothing for it in the grid. And they'll offer you free charging and potentially discounted parking or free parking. But the average person spends 3 times longer in the shopping centre getting a couple of dollars of free charge than an average customer, which means they're spending 3 times more opportunities to spend money on their credit card with the shopkeepers who are going to make more money, and then the shopping centres can put the rent up of the shops themselves. So people looking at different ways to encourage different forms of charging, and in those shopping centres, it's have a free charge and please spend more time in a shopping centre, spending more of your money.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd have to back onto that to say that in New South Wales, we've got a destination charging initiative, which we've just started. And the intent is to support regional locations to install those AC chargers that Scott was talking about, right? So we expect between 3,000 and 5,000 chargers to be installed through that program all across regional New South Wales. And that's backing onto the amazing initial network that the NRMA built out there to enable connectivity across the regions. And so through that, over the years that those will be installed, we're expecting EV charging to be ubiquitous right across regional New South Wales. It'll be easy to find an EV charger everywhere you go as you're travelling around our great state. Other states have taken this on board as well, like Victoria have a very similar scheme. Queensland have an electric vehicle superhighway, they call it, out into right across all of regional Queensland as well. And like Scott said, there's the opportunity for sites to potentially make some revenue out of those chargers. People are staying longer and visiting the sites and spending more money in these towns and locations. And they're excellent. A vehicle in an hour at these chargers can top up between 40 and about 140 kilometres of range in an hour, which gets them to the next town to do more charging. So it's really excellent.
Give me any excuse to spend a bit more time in a regional or a country bakery or a coffee shop to have another vanilla slice or another pie or another coffee. One of the big things that we are seeing, and I'd love to see a bit more of here in Australia, is when we're building DC charging locations, we're doing a great job now, and we had to start somewhere. We're putting 1 or 2 stations in. But what I'm seeing in Europe pre-COVID and the US is those sites are having 10, 15, 20 chargers in one location. And we'll get there when the volume of vehicles picks up. But I see frustration now, unfortunately, at sites where, that people lined up behind one charger, or there's a competitor charger next to us that no one can use apart from that one brand. But they'll line up behind a free NRMA charger and there'll be 5 people deep. And we've seen that frustration in places like Bathurst, for example. So having, I'd love to see the Tesla charge, the network in Australia opened up so I could use it. I pay for convenience. I don't care what brand it is. I don't care whose network it is. I will pay for convenience to charge up and get moving along. So I'm not stuck in the same cafe eating more and more pies.
And this is this has never been a problem as well. This kind of queuing for charging until very recently, but it's definitely starting to appear as an issue. Elon Musk has promised that his supercharging network will be made open and available to all brands. It started to happen in Europe and other places, so let's see when it happens in Australia. But it's a really good point around the number of chargers and fast chargers available in locations. And in New South Wales, we've taken the approach to ensure a minimum of 4 ultra-fast charging heads at each of our charging stations that we construct. And that provides a lot of redundancy. So 4 chargers that will be available per station at a minimum, and likely to be more at each station over time as well. And it's about, we have a pretty good ratio of public chargers to electric vehicles in Australia at the moment. So we're doing better. Stats I saw a couple of years ago, we have more, that ratio is better than America. It's better than New Zealand as an example. But as more EVs come on the road, and as the sheer demand for public charging increases, then the public charging network needs to be built up to keep up with that.
Yeah, I think there's something like 700 plus being deployed at this stage. And obviously with the announcement the NRMA had with the federal government, we'll be adding 117 to the national network. So, the numbers are only going to keep going up. And like both panelists have said, it'd be great to see people not having to suffer through lineups and just they should be able to get into the network and charge and head onto their road trip or head back home very easily. And we should strive really hard to make that happen in the next few years.
We are seeing something interesting when I'm driving around and get to spend a lot of time on electric vehicles and dealing with Parliament, heading down to Parliament to engage with our federal leaders. And I stop at Goulburn quite often. And I've been taking I-95 down the last couple of trips. And there's 2 chargers at North Goulburn there. One's a 50 kilowatt tritium and one's a 350 kilowatt. Whether it's an education thing, but we always find people that have cars that are max, they can't charge at 350 kilowatts. They can generally charge at 50 kilowatts or 100 max. Will jump onto the biggest, shiniest one available. And I turn up in a car that can take full advantage of that energy input into the vehicle, and I'm stuck on a much slower charger. So there's also, I suppose, that courtesy thing too, that, knowing what the intake capacity of the vehicle is and jumping on the charger that probably suits yours, rather than the one with the biggest, shiniest screen on it. It's one of those things. And I don't mind doing it, because usually when I stand at charge, I'm talking to people, talking about the technology, whether it's ours or our competitors' technology, and having a good yarn anyway. But when you are in a hurry and a rush and you're trying to get to that meeting with that minister that you've been dying for, stocking a slower charger can hurt a bit. I think
it should be made mandatory that all of Scott's favorite pie shops have 350 kilowatt chargers that are blocked for him whenever he turns up.
I've had to stop eating those things.
I feel like we need to clarify that for our listeners, we've thrown a lot of technical terms around AC, DC charging, 50 kilowatt chargers. Can you guys shed some light on what this all means for our listeners?
To start this answer, the charging speed of a vehicle, an electric vehicle, depends on the vehicle itself as well as the charger it's plugged into. So both of those have to work in tandem to allow the speed of the charge. On the AC front, AC chargers are typically between 7 kilowatts and 22 kilowatts of capacity, and they're a slower charger, but they're a dedicated charger and they can charge vehicles. But it depends on the vehicle itself, because that vehicle within the vehicle needs to convert to DC within it to create the charge. DC chargers, on the other hand, are from 50 kilowatts. That's the kind of starting point of fast chargers, up to 350 kilowatts. And a 350 kilowatt charger is what we call an ultra fast charger. All of that DC charging goes directly into the battery. It doesn't need conversion, so it's quite quick. It's quicker. But as Scott was mentioning, it depends on the capability of the vehicle. Some electric vehicles can charge at 50 kilowatts max, some at 80 kilowatts max, some over 200 kilowatts max. And so plugging an electric vehicle, it can only charge at 50 kilowatts into a 350 kilowatt charger. You'll still only be getting 50 kilowatts of charge maximum out of that charging session.
Awesome explanation. Thanks, Dave. And what about that? I do want to go back to one of the biggest barriers in terms of perception with consumers being range. So traveling long distances, we talked a lot about charging, but how good are batteries these days? Do they wear out quickly? How long can you drive with an electric vehicle?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And we've got a range of batteries in our cars. We've got, our Ioniq that started off and got a lot of those through private fleets and also government fleets. They had 311 kilometres range. The Kona EV, the big battery, could do 484 kilometres. And it all comes down to the person behind the pedal. Same with the petrol car. You can get people who drive really, really efficiently, and people that say my car gets terrible efficiency, but they're always hard on the accelerator and hard on the brake. The technology in EVs is awesome. And I think one of the best things I like doing on drive days, where there's a number of branded cars there or different brand cars, is I love driving myself. Someone who spent 10 years at NRMA and was judging for best car awards, I just love tech. Is using people's different technologies, using regenerative braking to try and capture more energy, put it back into the battery, using eco modes and power modes and different ways of driving the vehicle to maximise either the power I want or maximise the range I want. And the vehicles have all got heaps of tech to show you that if you turn the air conditioner on, you're going to drop 20 Ks, or you're going to do this, or you put it in power mode, you're going to have this much range left. Batteries themselves are pretty good these days. Most manufacturers have got good batteries between 300 Ks and 500 kilometres right now. Some do a little bit more, some do a little bit less, but anything from 3 to 500 is pretty suitable. I drive from the Blue Mountains into Macquarie Park each day, and it's about a 60K round trip, and been doing EVs for years. I'll happily drive to Canberra and halfway back again before I need to think about charging. Although most times I find a hotel where I can trickle charge overnight. So I do pretty extreme kilometres compared to most people, and don't really even think twice about charging because I've come used to it. It's like charging your mobile phone. I don't panic about my mobile phone. I know generally how I use it during the day, and if I need to charge it at night or night. And cars are the same thing. Once people become used to them, they'll be right. And I think one of the best things we can do as manufacturers is probably, I like the idea of those 24-hour test drives of going to a drive day and not being with the salesman. Go and live with it, drive it yourself and experience it. And guaranteeing most people that experience an EV, doesn't matter our brand or someone else's brand, are sold. And if you can deal with the range, as depending on what battery size you build, the range, the power and torque, and if you can understand the slow and fast charging times, both the AC at home or the DC in the network, if you can live with that, and most people can, an EV is a really great choice. We love to see them, more affordable, have more choice and more affordable EVs here. But that's the hardest thing is for ourselves, is not trying to show people how many cup holders and how many speakers the car's got and all these great functions and features and how sleek they look. It's getting people to understand what is your daily drive really. Most people don't do that once a year or once every 5 year run to Queensland, especially the way airfares are. It's pretty easy to fly and rent an EV when you get to that location. If you can live with the range of the vehicles out there from 300 Ks to 500 kilometres, do it. But we still see a lot of government and business fleet managers come to us and say, we need a car 500 kilometres. That's good. What's the average range of your cars each day? And most our cars generally do between 20 and 60 kilometres a day, or at the extreme, someone might do 100 kilometres in a day. Then you don't need a car with 500 kilometres range. Get an affordable car with 300 kilometres range, and every third car you get, that fourth one is free. So it's actually understanding what your fleet usage is, or your daily drive is, and buy the battery that suits that. Don't buy a battery that's too big, especially a number of our cars have different size batteries, so you can choose standard range or a long range, and so do other manufacturers. Don't overpurchase. It's never become easy when there's a lot more infrastructure in place as well. So if you're going to drive to Port Macquarie or drive to Melbourne or drive to Queensland once a year or once every couple of years, the infrastructure is going in place right now quite quickly to be able to enable that in any a car with 300 kilometre range can do that quite easily and quite effectively.
Yeah, Barbara, as you can tell from the numbers that Scott's given you, the EVs are definitely not ruining anyone's weekend. In fact, there is a Facebook group called I Ruined the Weekend, where you can see kind of these intimate stories about people doing 1,000K trips while towing their trailers. And, and while we can't do the entire Highway 1, which is like 14,500 kilometers yet, but as Scott said, the infrastructure is going in, and it'll be possible at some stage. And you can do these long trips using the NRMA charging network, or the ones by the other providers. You can do the Great Ocean Road. You can do the Cradle Mountain Drive. You can do Adelaide to Port Augusta, Sydney to Coffs Harbour, Brisbane to Cairns. With the highway network that David was talking about before. So there's definitely the range to do the sort of trips that the average Australian family does now.
Absolutely, you can go from Cairns to Sydney to Melbourne to Adelaide, all in electric vehicle, a modern electric vehicle easily. And if you think about the average Australian commute, which is around 38 kilometres or so, and the average EV battery range, which is around 400 kilometres, then it's, they don't need to be charged on average only every 10 days. And so it's a bit of an education piece, I think, for people to start to shift to the mindset of, and that's a one charge every 10 days, or it can be trickle charged absolutely every night and be full every single morning. There's examples of electric vehicles that have traveled 500,000 kilometers. They've done 1 million kilometers. One just ticked over in the last couple of weeks to 1 million miles. Now, there are a couple of battery replacements there under warranty, but one of the great stats is one of those legs, the driver did 400,000 kilometers on the one battery, no problems, and the range started at something like 340 kilometers. It was a second-hand battery, and by the end of those 400,000 kilometers, it still had 310 kilometers of range on it. So the degradation is not very significant, and most car makers are warranting their EV batteries for 7 or 8 years, and noting that to be a 70% capacity at the end of those 7 or 8 years. So the technology is really mature. It's getting better kind of by the day, and the car is probably going to fall apart around the battery, in all honesty.
And for those ultra long drives as well, from a road safety perspective, people should be taking a break every 2 hours anyway. Whether to use the facilities or go and grab something to eat or drink, but you should be getting out of the car, stretch your legs, and keeping yourself awake and alert so when you start the next leg of the journey. And what a great time to charge up the vehicle for 10 or 15 minutes and have a bit of a walk around to keep yourself fit to drive.
So it seems to me that range anxiety shouldn't be such a big problem once people actually start driving electric vehicles and get used to the new technology and then see that it's not such a big deal at all. But I wanted to touch on something that we mentioned a lot of times in our conversation, which is the support that the New South Wales government is providing. So, David, what exactly is the New South Wales government doing? You have a package of nearly $600 million to support the transition to electric and fuel cell electric vehicles in coming years. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it is that you're doing?
Sure, thank you. And thanks to the others for kind of bringing it up a few times throughout the podcast so far. So yes, look, the New South Wales electric vehicle strategy is focused in on those key barriers, as I mentioned, and has a range of initiatives to try and overcome some of those and accelerate electric vehicle uptake. So firstly, on cost, with New South Wales has $3,000 rebates for electric vehicles under a $68,750 threshold, but also we've eliminated stamp duty for electric vehicles under $78,000. So combined, that's reducing the upfront cost between around $2,500 to $5,500, $2,000 to $5,500 on average. So that's a good upfront price reduction there. And we also have a very strong focus on fleets. So there's a $105 million fleets incentive that's there to support both council and private fleets that are operating 10 or more vehicles to shift to procure new battery electric vehicles or fuel cell electric vehicles and smart chargers. And so any business of that size that's eligible can bid into that process. It's a competitive bidding process, and rounds run every 6 months, with the next one starting just soon in July 2022. So alongside that, we're also electrifying our entire passenger fleet in New South Wales. It's 12,000 vehicles or so, roughly. It's probably the largest fleet in the Southern Hemisphere. And between all of those, all of that electrification effort, all of the support for new vehicles, tens of thousands of new vehicles, electric vehicles, we're going to be creating a flourishing secondhand market for EVs, which is really kind of absent at the moment. So that's on the vehicle and the cost front. On the charging front, I've already spoken about that destination charging program. The fast charging initiative we've got is to support private industry to build, own and operate ultra fast charging stations right across the state. So it's we estimate around 250 of these stations will be constructed over the next few years and be building out across our highways, so about 2,000 kilometres of highways, and ensuring that they're built at 100-kilometre intervals. So that range we talked about, 300 to 500 kilometres of range, you can skip charging stations along your travel and still find one 100 kilometres down the path. Plus a big focus on commuter corridors in metro areas and areas with limited off-street parking. So that funding's already starting to go out the door through our first round, which is concluded. And importantly to say, that all of those charges will be fully charged or powered by renewable energy. That's a really critical thing for the New South Wales government, as all of this work is done through an emissions reduction lens. So lots of initiatives on the table. We've already allowed electric vehicles to travel in T2 and T3 transit lanes in New South Wales, so a bit of a sweetener for those that already own them for a short period of time. And then we're also looking at shifting over our entire 8,000 strong bus fleet to be low emissions vehicles as well. So a lot going on in New South Wales, and a lot that other states are doing as well, and replicating efforts in New South Wales. So there's upfront price reductions and incentives in Queensland, West Australia, Victoria, and most states are building out charging infrastructure networks as well.
That's so good to hear, and I can't wait for the buses to be electrified, because I hate the diesel buses. They're super noisy and polluting, so I'm really looking forward to that. Now, on a Commonwealth level, Australia continues to be one of the only OECD nations, along with Russia, that has not adopted fuel efficiency standards, as we've heard before, or any other form of regulation to encourage an increase in the supply of low and zero emissions vehicles. Other nations are leading the transition, and we are becoming, as the Electric Vehicle Council is calling it, a dumping ground for high emissions vehicles. What does the Commonwealth Government need to do to be part of the solution? And what are the major levers it has available to effect change? So is the $500 million future fuels and vehicles strategy enough, or should the Commonwealth Government be doing more, in your opinion?
From an automotive industry perspective, we're looking forward to working with the government to introduce an emission regulation here in Australia, and that's going to ensure that we can get our fair share of vehicles from other markets in the world. And as we said, we're opening up plants in our region, in Indonesia, in Singapore and other places, just building EVs. So whether we take cars from those plants, or those plants at the moment are just making for those countries themselves, what it means is those countries that have a plant now don't need to pull cars from Korea. We can pull more volume from those markets. So that's the plan anyway. So having an emission regulation gives us a target that sets a line in the sand. It gives a clear signal to all car manufacturers: this is what you need to meet at what point in time, whether it's a transition to banning internal combustion, or it's just an emission regulation to get to a certain CO2 level between now and 2030 or 2040 or 2050. We need something to aim to and work to. We plan cars 5 and 10 years in advance. An average life cycle of vehicles over 5 years. So you need to have something to work towards and plan towards. We need that KPI, that target to start to plan our businesses. Now, we're in a great position from a Hyundai Motor Group perspective, from our both EV and hydrogen fuel cell, but there's a lot of manufacturers out there that need a lot of time to start planning and considering what those changes need to be. Because what we don't want to see, and it probably sounds funny coming from a brand, but we don't want to see a lot of manufacturers dropping on this market really quickly, which really denies consumer choice. We don't make cars that suit everyone's needs in the market. We don't make a ute. So we do need good competitors here with a wide range of vehicle body styles and in different segments to meet our unique requirements here in Australia. So having something we can all work towards is going to make it easy. We're not guessing at the moment. We're guessing, and while we're guessing, our parent companies, whether it be in Korea or Japan or Germany or anywhere else in the world, the US, are going to send cars to the markets where there's regulation and targets in place, because you want to avoid financial liabilities, and every manufacturer wants to do really well and sell big volumes of their product against their competitors.
I'd add that internationally, we know that fuel efficiency standards are impactful. So that's the key thing to say. We don't have them here, but we know they're very impactful internationally. But the Commonwealth Government has other levers at their disposal. So I believe that the incoming Labor government has committed to eliminating import duties for electric vehicles. So they're not on all electric vehicles, but that's a kind of an upfront cost thing that they've committed to. But there's also the fringe benefits tax, which is a Commonwealth tax as well. So they have a range of levers that they could employ to make electric vehicles the greater consumer choice. And as we've seen from that Norway example, they're the kind of levers that they pulled to make the change happen. The Future Fuels Fund is fantastic. It's doubled to $500 million over the last month, and it's got a strong focus on that charging infrastructure rollout and on focusing and on support and research and incentives for fleets to move to look at smart charging, grid integration. So really important parts of the puzzle, but all incentive based.
Yeah, and as David said, those incentives are very important. The fringe FBT exemption, for example, on a $50,000 car, that's about $9,000 in savings for the employers. With the import tariff on a $50,000 car, that's about $2,000 worth of savings. So all those kind of things add up, along with the deployment of more infrastructure to enable uptake. And the Future Fuels Fund, the kind of the latter focus, the second round focus is on the integration of hydrogen and electric vehicles into commercial fleets. That's such a key part of this journey. So lots of excellent initiatives in play that will lead to increased uptake. But as Scott said, I think having that line in the sand with a mandatory CO2 standard, I think will definitely be useful on many fronts.
Also, a big one is creating a second-hand market. I think whether it be state, territory, or federal government fleets. I think everyone's auntie or uncle or parents owned an ex-government Commodore or a Falcon or a Camry at one stage. It was just a thing to do back in the day. But getting those cars into those fleets, those big fleets owned by the government, they need to swap over every 3 or 4 years anyway. We've seen a great trial done by one of the big fleet companies that we work with, and we work with all the fleet companies, but SG Fleet looks after the federal government and the territory fleet, and also parts of New South Wales, I believe, and a number of other states. They've done some really good work on the total cost of ownership, and it made sense to run an electric vehicle, whether it's ours or Nissan's, for 4 years compared to a Camry hybrid for 3 years. So because the batteries have the big warranty, I've got an 8-year warranty on our batteries, you're still going to sell the vehicle in its 3rd or 4th or 5th year with factory warranty on the battery. So I think that transition, those big corporate and especially government fleets, if we look at a fleet that I target first, and Australia Post, they've got a huge passenger white box fleet moving all our parcels around. They've got trucks that are running up and down every single highway, every single day of the week, whether they're prime movers, multi-combination trailers, or rigid trucks. It's a federal government fleet. Looking at those early and clear examples, those Australia Post trucks run the same routes every single week between the states and the regional areas. There's your network of hydrogen refueling stations. Then your other guys, your tolls, the other big freight operators, and can start using the same things as well. So it's a matter of, and I think New South Wales, Queensland, Victorian governments are working towards that. But it's how do we get that alignment with that federal government leadership with the station, and the great work being done by states and territories now. And the new Albanese government's new and fresh. And I think they've got a lot of great ideas, as well as the previous government and the work that was done through ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corp for infrastructure. But I think we're going to see a bit of an acceleration here. And I think we're going to see more consistency across what needs to be done across states and territories with that strong federal leadership with cars. And, I'm probably one of the greenest people you find in a car manufacturer, but we can't move too fast either. If we bring in the ban of internal combustion to meet Europe, or even some parties are talking about trying to do it even faster. If we had a government that was in minority and needed support of other independents and Greens, the risk there was that we're going to reduce consumer choice and rush things a bit too fast. I think we've got the best balance now of having the industry working with government, industry, and the charging networks and the energy operators, and everyone to sit down and understand what is a nice planned out time to do this. Because there's no use bringing in too many cars and we haven't enough places to charge them. That's happening right now with some frustration out in the public charging networks. And there's no use building these gold-plated stations that you've got no cars to use them on. So it's about industry and government and the finances and the energy people working together to do this in a planned and staged practice. Again, being 10 years behind US and Europe means we've got some great examples to work off, and the technology has matured far more than when they put in their network. So taking advantage of the best technology, the best load shedding, energy balancing technology to ensure that we complement our grid and don't impact it.
I'm glad Scott brought that point up. I think, the feasibility of the industry to meet those standards is very important. We can't have, reduction on vehicle choice and it adding more impost on consumers and motorists, causing us to a setback in the journey. So I think that's totally support what Scott's saying there.
So we talked so much about government support, etc., but I do want to turn our attention to corporate fleets, and I want to talk about how businesses can get going with their EV and fuel cell EV plans and helping accelerate the change away from petrol and diesel. So previously, Scott, you mentioned a couple of really important things that businesses would have to look at in terms of evaluating their current fleet and their needs. So I want to drill into that a bit more. What should businesses do now to get started?
Yeah, I mean, if they've got a larger fleet of vehicles, they've probably got a fleet management team or a fleet team looking after them anyway. So understanding exactly what vehicles can be transferred over. Now, I'm always amused when I talk to, especially local government or some states that have a massive range of utes in their pool, and I ask them what they've been used for, and most times they're not being used for ute type of duties. They've been used to take some packages around town or just to transfer people around town. But once in a blue moon, once in the 3-year lease period, they might have to go off road onto gravel somewhere. So can an equivalent vehicle, you may need to have one of those vehicles in your fleet, but do you need a whole fleet team or fleet of utes when a Kona EV or a Nissan Leaf or a Tesla Model 3, something may do the equivalent job, but one, it's a lot smaller on the road. Two, it's probably the safety in modern cars, especially EVs, is right up there. So understanding how your vehicle's being used and does it need to be a ute or something large or commercial, doesn't need to be a full size passenger carrying vehicle. Can it be something smaller, like the size of an MG or a Hyundai Kona or a Nissan Leaf? Again, I don't care what brand you choose, just choose something greener and cleaner and start to get people to focus away from I need a big car because I want a big car. It's just that whole mentality. It has to be bigger, safer. Having the chance and opportunity with working for NRMA for 10 years of crash testing for Anchor for a number of years and studying fatalities with different organisations, big doesn't mean safer. Very rarely means safer. So a lot of times the best technology is in the latest cars and in the most affordable cars in many cases. So getting those people to understand their fleets and trying to educate them about what charging is. We spoke about the whole charging thing. It comes back to the education. It's far easier for a fleet manager or business to say, here's Barbara, here's your fuel card. Make your expense claims once a month and see you later. That can be as simple as that with EVs, but they just need to understand the tools to be able to do that. So that's our biggest thing, is just trying to help people understand. And I think as an automotive industry and government and NRMA, as a consumer advocate, we probably could all be doing a lot better in that area of consumer awareness, and we'll probably see things start to change there from the federal leadership as well.
Scott's talked about some really excellent elements to fleet transition. I'd talk about a fleet transition plan. So do a full fleet transition plan, look at the model availability that's out there now and what's fit for purpose. So Scott, you spoke about that really well just then. Think about that phasing of the entire fleet over to low emissions vehicles or a plug-in electric vehicle, if that's the suitable choice in the first instance, or the full battery electric vehicle. So that transition planning and thinking about total cost of ownership. And I think we've touched on that throughout the podcast. I think it's a critical thing to think about, and from an education piece, it's central to shifting to electric vehicles, because in the past, there wasn't much difference between a larger vehicle and a medium and a smaller vehicle in terms of total cost of ownership. It was just all about upfront cost. And there's a lot of talk about price parity. Price parity is one thing, but it's not the thing about shifting to an electric vehicle, because across the life of ownership, because electric vehicles are 5 to 10 times cheaper to operate than a traditionally fueled car, the total cost of ownership is the important calculation to do. And businesses and larger businesses and fleets should be able to do that and be doing it already. And that makes the case to the shift to electric vehicles alongside the emissions reductions, that cost side of things. Also thinking about in that transition plan, what are the charging needs? Is that at home? Is that at the depot? Is that in the building? And then billing. So we've already talked slightly about billing, the software solutions available now to reimburse employees. They're available now. So I guess the key message is think about total cost of ownership, do a transition plan, and get started now. the cars are here. It's a mature technology, and the shift can start happening now, and a business will start to fall behind if they don't start doing it today.
I think that's very key, what David, the last point David raised, because I think you have to be realistic about the time period it might take to transition the fleet based on the the size of the fleet. It could be up as long as 12 to 18 months or more. And, obviously with facilities upgrades that might be needed from an electrical engineering perspective, finding out what the demand is in the building that you are in, and then the switchboard upgrades that you might need, permissions that you might need from the building owners if you're commercially renting the building. I think, and then making that thorough business plan that factors in lifetime cost and the kind of vehicles you need and what proportion of your fleet you need to transition. I think just factoring in that time is very important, and just be patient in doing your research, find out what regulatory incentives are available for you, and make a solid business plan as you do it. I think that'll lead to a more effective fleet transition. At least that's what we are hearing from. We're doing 20 EV drive days in partnership with the New South Wales government, and we have some fleet days there, and we talk to fleet managers on there, and just trying to understand some of the transitionary plans that they have in play. That seems to be something on top of their mind.
We are seeing something at the moment which is really surprising me, is the efficient use of fleets or the inefficient use of fleets. Having a building, whether it be a government office or whether it be a private business, where they've got a fleet of 30 cars in the car park because each department's had a certain amount of, or each department with that business had a certain amount of vehicles in that department. And when you see cars coming through for servicing that they have done, and we see it quite often, I actually get phone calls from service managers saying, we've got cars coming through, they've only done a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand K since its last service a year ago. Why are those vehicles there in the first place? Can you have a fleet of vehicles that are spread across a number of departments rather than having them a share of vehicles in one department, and having it like you're booking a meeting room or booking a Zoom meeting? With the telematics in vehicles and the functionality in vehicles, the fleet manager or the building operator or the person who controls the meeting rooms or the car fleet can see what cars are being used, what cars are currently being charged, what cars are being parked in the basement, not being charged and empty. And you can allocate cars based on the one with the most amount of range in it. Currently, we see so many examples of it. And it's not just in government, it's in private business as well. I hear about it from businesses themselves, and a number of fleet companies are working with government and businesses around Australia to look at that asset sharing in a building, not just having a fleet of cars for every department, but having a fleet of cars for that building that's shared like a meeting room, office booking type setup, and getting that vehicle out, used every day on the road as much as we can, and reducing costs, reducing complexity, and reducing assets that we see going to auction after a certain period of life that have been really underused, and it's disappointing in some cases.
In your opinion, should businesses shift to electric and hydrogen vehicles right away, or is there a phase where they would switch to hybrids and low emissions vehicle first and then to electric vehicles? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, we're lucky enough, we're the only manufacturer to have hybrid, plug-in hybrid, electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles globally still, I think, especially here in Australia, we're the only ones to have it. But we see hybrid and plug-in hybrid technology as a stepping stone or a transition. Our ultimate aim, and because of emission regs and global targets, is to go zero emission. Start with one or two cars. Start with 1 or 2% of your fleet, 3% of your fleet. Don't go and replace 1,000 cars tomorrow with EV because you're trying to make some net zero emission target that you've got to have for this year or next year. Start with a couple of cars. Speak to the NRMA. Speak to the state government and industry experts, whether it's car manufacturers or some of the consumer advocacy people, or whether it's the jet chargers or the other people. Get some information with those first couple of cars, and make sure your drivers know how to drive them, drive an EV properly, how to charge properly, how to do things. A lot of people offer those education programs for that, or you can find a heap of resources on the web, and I'm sure the government and NRMA's got plenty of resources too. But you can, having a couple of cars to start with, and we've seen this with so many councils across Australia, they've done it really good with a couple of cars to start with, and now they've gone to the fleets of 20, 30, 40 or 100 EVs because they didn't rush it and shock people. They bled them into the technology, had drive days, and had cake parties around the car to talk about different things in the vehicle, talk about the safety and the technology on the vehicle. And it's really trying to, we spoke about it before, is to ensure people aren't thinking about the misconceptions of what an EV can and can't do. Like any vehicle, they have their limitations. they also have a lot of benefits as well. And if people have properly explained that, and they become, in most cases, we find those people become our advocates. They're advocates for our brand and our competitors' brands, and advocates for the technology, want to tell their friends and family about their work car they're driving, which is an EV. And for me, that's a massive win. There's not one EV in Australia that we've got council that isn't heavily branded with different messaging about net zero future and efficiency. So for us, they're a great branding tool as well to help educate the community.
Thank you. And we're almost out of time, but I do want to ask you guys the question about how you see the future. Over what time scale do you expect the transition to zero emissions transport fuels to take? Will we be living in a zero emissions transport world by 2050? Or will it take longer than that for change to happen? Will some modes transition quicker than others, such as passenger cars and public buses and trains? And will future vehicles be powered with renewables?
Get my
crystal ball.
Get my crystal ball out. And that all comes down to the government of the day and the federal government of the day. Emission regulation is going to drive this. And when we talk about 2030, 2040, 2050, that, of course, is going to be driven by that line in the sand we spoke about. What are we as car manufacturers targeting for both heavy and light vehicles? And then we've got the great opportunity of agriculture and marine and rail and everything else that's going to transition as well. It's going to be interesting. The next 10 years are going to be, if you're a fan of the automotive sector and love technology, the next 5 to 10 years is going to be amazing around the world, and some great opportunities for Australia, because we're a net exporter of energy. We don't import any energy. We hopefully move away from importing our liquid fuels and powering with our own green sunshine.
Yeah, I'd say the opportunity is gigantic, and the shift to electric vehicles is inevitable. Those two things combined. The duration depends, like Scott said, on support, how quickly the shift can happen within car manufacturers and so forth. I think it's going to happen faster than people predict. We've seen it with solar, we've seen it with LED lighting, and what most people don't see in the background are the cost reduction curves happening, both in battery technology, the sheer investment being put in place by both governments and the industry globally. It's in the billions and billions and billions and tens of billions of dollars, it's inevitable and it's happening, and the technology is mature already.
Yeah, I'll repeat my oft-repeated sentiment on this, is that I dream of a beautiful world where by 2030 we will have addressed the supply crunch, we have the charging infrastructure that's necessary, and we've cleared some basic misconceptions about what transportation powered by renewable energy can do for us as a society. And if we can achieve that, there is no reason why we would not be living in that kind of idealized utopian world in 2050. We can make that happen.
Definitely. And having heard all about the global drivers, Australia's uptake, the barriers, the enablers, good transition plans for corporate fleets, etc., after all of that, what would be your key takeaway messages that you want to leave our listeners with?
I'll go first. I think it's very important to, if you are an EV enthusiast, if you know more on what's happening with the sustainable transport solutions for the future, it's very important that you have those barbecue chats and talk to your family and friends and help them make them aware of the possibilities offered by those solutions. I'll give you a great example. I was talking to some elderly relatives of the weekend who said to me, electric vehicles will never take off in Australia because it's a large country. And, they're the kind of people who drive their car to their 2 grandkids who live 2 kilometers away, go shopping 3 kilometers away. Electric vehicles with the smaller batteries, perfect for them. So, that's most people. They have low driving demands. So you will find in the conversation with those people that, this is not like charging your mobile phone or any of those other solutions. You can power a home with this at some stage when the technology arrives. So I think that conversation is very important. So if you are capable of those conversations, and there's plenty of resources that the NRMA and the New South Wales governments provides you as well in terms of education, please pass it on so that we can usher in the revolution quicker.
Yep, definitely learn about them. Businesses should start to get into them and start to procure some as trials or starting the transition of their full fleets, and test drive one if you haven't already. And by being in one and driving it around a little while, you'll understand what that they're a normal vehicle. They're just a normal car. They're just not producing any emissions. So get yourself educated on it.
Can I just sneak in a promo to come and attend the 20 EV drive days that we are running in partnership with the New South Wales Government across regional and rural New South Wales and even the metro. So come and experience them. And there's a lot of OEMs there, including Scott's company. So, we very much look forward to you coming and experiencing an EV and obviously getting that knowledge firsthand from charging providers and all the members who are part of the EV ecosystem.
And what about you, Scott?
Yeah, the biggest one for ourselves is get into a car, whether it's our brand or one of our competitors, get into an EV, experience it, whether at a drive day or go and visit a dealer, speak to the salesman, or just follow some of the social media about EVs. A lot of people talking about them. There are some people still kicking the technology, but there's a lot of positive commentary. Make your own mind up, but just get a chance to drive a vehicle by yourself and experience it. I'm sure you'll be sold.
Perfect. And for people who want to find out more, what's the best way of connecting with you?
From car manufacturers, go into our websites, check out all manufacturers have got great websites talking about the technology, talk about charging times, cost calculators for, what's the difference for powering your vehicle today with petrol and against the daily range you do against what it would look like, what you pay for home energy and the kilometres you do. So some great tools online for most manufacturers that can find that, and certainly have a look at our website, hyundai.com.au, and check out the calculators there to work out whether an EV is right for you today.
Yeah, certainly the case for us as well. It's all online. Just look up New South Wales electric vehicle strategy, and all of the various initiatives and support materials and so forth are there. How to get rebates and so forth, and information about electric vehicles as well. NRMA have an excellent EV hub online as well, and Nikesh probably has more to say.
Yeah, as David said, the NRMA's EV Hub is the go-to portal for you online if you want to learn more about not just broadly about the EV technology, but also what the New South Wales Government is doing and how that might benefit you in terms of purchasing and owning and charging an EV. But we are expanding on some of those features, including creating an EV community online and obviously doing more experiential sessions like the EV drive days that we are having that will enable you to actually experience them firsthand. We even run education sessions on those days where you get to hear from actual EV owners, charging providers. So just a lot of initiatives that'll be rolling out, and the website and all our social channels will be the portal to be on. But reach out to me on LinkedIn at any time as well. I'm totally happy to support you with information or with anything else I can do for you.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. I want to thank you so much for giving up your time to have this discussion today.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you,
Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara.
That was Scott, David, and Nikesh talking about how we can reduce our transport emissions. If you know another person who you think would enjoy this podcast, please let them know so that more people can hear about best practice stories of how organizations are moving to net zero emissions. Remember, to reach net zero emissions, aim high, always be curious, and act now. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode.